Stand by.
Okay, Libby, you want to put up the splash screen?
We are 1 minute out. Stand by. We are about to go on air. Stand by. We are on the air.
We are good to go, Sam.
Great. Welcome, everyone, to Mornings with Planning, a webinar series hosted the first Wednesday of every month, where the Lexington Division of Planning discusses new ways to reconnect, reimagine, and respond in a new reality. Excuse me. These webinars will be held live via Zoom and on Lex TV. It is also being recorded for later viewing at imaginelexington.com, as well as Saturday at 1 p.m. on Lex TV. This webinar is eligible for an AICP credit. My name is Samantha Castro. I'm a senior long-range planner with the Lexington Division of Planning, and I will be your moderator for our final session of 2021, which also means it is a special 90-minute session. So hopefully you can stick around with us. During this webinar, we will be discussing urban design in context. Kick back with your morning coffee or tea, and let's meet today's panelists. We have 4 panelists today. Lewis Johnson, Senior Landscape Architect and Urban Designer at Gresham Smith & Partners. Liz Swanson, Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of Kentucky's College of Design. Luis Huber-Calvo, Associate Planner at MKSK. And Autumn Goderwis, Administrative Officer with the city's Division of Planning. So panelists, thank you for joining us this morning. We'll begin today by having each of you give the audience kind of a brief overview of your background. Lewis, you have done extensive work throughout the Southeast, and particularly in Lexington, in the North Limestone area, and most recently on Town Branch Commons. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Absolutely. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everybody, for having us. So I grew up in Kentucky, and through. I've lived kind of equal parts Lexington and Louisville, where I'm sitting right now. I studied landscape architecture at the University of Kentucky and did a graduate degree at Georgia Tech in urban design specifically. And really been kind of focused on that. My focus has really been on community planning, urban design types of projects. More recently getting into kind of influencing the public realm. Town Branch Commons, like Sam mentioned, which is well underway, and some new park projects. We're working on Charles Young and other things like that right now. We're really passionate about kind of how landscape architecture can influence quality of life and sort of everybody's day-to-day experiences and how we enjoy and live in our cities. So thanks, glad to be here.
Liz, on the flip side, you come from the world of architecture and academia, having taught in the College of Design for well over a decade now. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Sam. I appreciate it. I grew up in a suburb of Chicago and did my undergraduate degree at the University of Michigan, where I started as an art student, but eventually graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Architecture. At which point I worked for several years in architecture firms in North Carolina and Ann Arbor and back in Chicago before going back to graduate school at Berkeley, where I did my master's of architecture there. I love that you think I've only been here a decade. That makes me feel so young, but I've actually been teaching here at the University of Kentucky in the School of Architecture since 2001. So this marks my 20th year here, where I have taught at every level of our program, from first year on up to graduate studios, in addition to teaching drawing and history of architecture way back when, and most recently teaching a course for non-majors, which focuses on helping them read their visual environment and understand visual culture. Currently, I'm teaching second year architecture studio and a series of my electives online, which I love, because second year is really that first moment in our curriculum where students are grappling with the complexities of program and site analysis and designing their first kind of like real building projects. So I'm thrilled to be here and just to hear from everyone else.
Thank you.
I am so sorry to interrupt. Lex TV, we're getting a report that you are offline.
Let's hang on and we can try and see if we can get them online. Liz, admittedly, I was only giving you a decade at school because my husband had you in one of your first classes you taught. And so if you've been teaching for 20 years.
That's right. Chris,
Yeah.
he was my student. Yeah, I would love to think I'm that young, but
I apologize.
Pam, if you just want to keep going.
Okay. I can do that. Luis, I know you're heavily involved in community-led planning and just finished up the Imagine Nicholasville Road study. Can you tell us a little bit more on, what else you've worked on and what your background is?
Yeah, good morning, Sam, and thank you for having me here today. My name is Luis Huber-Calvo. I'm an urban planner with MKSK based out of our Louisville office. I was actually born and raised in Barranquilla, Colombia, and I moved to the United States when I was 18. I've lived in a few places along the way, notably Atlanta, Miami, then Columbus, Ohio, and now Louisville. I've been in Louisville for about 5 years, so I very much consider it home, and I very much love it. So at my time with MKSK, now about 8 years, I've mostly focused on district and downtown planning across the Midwest. I've been fortunate to be in Louisville for 5 years, but most of my work actually spans across the entire eastern part of the country, as west as Tulsa so far. Right now, I've been working on downtown plans in Florida and TOD planning in Northwest Indiana. I very much enjoy doing neighborhood planning and things that involve things right here in Louisville, where I consider it now my hometown. And I really enjoy things that involve working with the community. Community engagement, I think, is one of the most important and crucial parts of the planning process, and something where our recommendations always have to trace back to. So I really appreciate the conversation that we're having today about urban design. This is one of the things that I'm also very passionate about. So thanks, Sam.
Thanks. And Autumn, last but not least, you were recently promoted from being the Board of Adjustment Officer for the Division of Planning to an Administrative Officer in Planning Services. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm another lifelong Kentuckian. I grew up in Paducah. I moved to Lexington to attend University of Kentucky's architecture program. So I'm a graduate of that program. I never had Liz as a professor, but I know she certainly sat on some critiques and saw some of my work at that time. And there's probably a reason that I'm more in the planning field now. But I really was introduced to planning. Growing up in Paducah, they established an arts district in the historic portion of downtown. And I didn't know what planning was at all at that time, but I've always thought that was really cool. And then as I went through the University of Kentucky Architecture School program, I was always sort of more drawn to things that were related to urban design and public space and that kind of thing. So I've kind of ended up migrating over my professional career into the planning world. I've been with the Division of Planning in Lexington for about 5 years.
Great. Okay, so let's move into some questions. We're running this session a little bit differently since we have a panel full of design professionals. So we would be remiss if we didn't show some visuals. So our hope is that by showing good and not so good elements of design, we can reinforce what the panelists are saying. We received loads of questions from registrants, which have been integrated into the questions coming momentarily. So thank you for sharing your thoughts and curiosities. Audience members in attendance, feel free to submit questions using the Q&A functionality, and I will work to cover that content alongside the questions submitted via the registration form. And we also have live Q&A support from members of staff here. As an icebreaker question, I'd love to ask all of you about a place that you've been to with inspirational urban design, and kind of what principles of urban design do you think are at play there to really make that place sing? And anybody can hop in.
I'll jump in. So a place that I recently visited actually was one of my favorite spots. And this was my first post-pandemic trip, so that was already very special. It was a few weeks ago, and I went back to my home country of Colombia, and I visited one of my favorite cities in the world, Medellin. And the amazing thing about Medellin is its willingness to prioritize pedestrians and bicyclists and transit riders over anything else. And it's the willingness to make the personal car driver probably the least convenient mode of transportation. And that's reflected in every single street and reflected in every single decision that is made. The transit system is amazing. It includes heavy rail, the only heavy rail in Colombia, light rail, streetcar, cable cars, and BRT. They all work together as a single system. You get one card, you will get one fare, and you transfer anywhere you want. Really, it shouldn't be that amazing, but it actually is. And the second favorite thing that I would note is the ability to connect to the local government's ability to connect to previously disenfranchised neighborhoods on the hillsides of the city by creating cable cars, electric escalators to go up the hills, reducing a travel time that used to be 2 hours to get from some of the neighborhoods into the downtown core to just about 15 minutes. So I really encourage everyone to, if they have a chance to visit, it's a very safe place to go these days. And if you really want to be inspired by some public art, it's also the place to visit.
Great. Liz, I saw you unmute yourself.
There are a lot of places I've been that I found inspiring, but I'll just mention two of my favorite cities in the whole world, which are always kind of touchstones that I return to in my imagination, which is Amsterdam and Barcelona. I love both of these cities for many reasons, some of which Luis just touched on because of their prioritization of biking and pedestrian travel. But from an architectural standpoint, what I love about both of these places is their ability over the years to grow and change with respect to their historic urban fabric, but at the same time simultaneously embracing some of the most cutting edge, forward-thinking contemporary architecture that I have seen. So I think for many successful places, successful urban design is that has the ability to kind of marry both of those values, that we have to respect our past and really protect those places that carry our memory and hold our collective identity within them, within those buildings, but also leave room for new expressions and new places that can reflect who we are today moving forward into our future.
Fantastic.
I think I would echo Liz's two cities as ones that are particularly great, and add to that list Rome. I just really love the historic juxtaposition with the modern that you see there, and it's so amazing to just be walking down the street and then just happen upon like a ruin. It's just really incredible.
There's so many places you all have already said. I think just for me, I love to travel. It's one of the reasons I love being an urban designer. And my wife, who's a pharmacist, I think kind of is super jealous of, part of our job is literally just traveling and looking at places and thinking about places. And it's so cool. I think in America, For us, Portland, Oregon, I think is an incredible place to go for a lot of the reasons Louis mentioned, just about how you, and I think that's a really important note, is how you move around a city and how you feel when you move around a city and how kind of directly impactful that is to how you enjoy it. In places like Savannah, Georgia, and others are places you can go visit. Even Chattanooga right now is doing some incredible things downtown. I think internationally, the Netherlands, I mean, Amsterdam for sure, but Rotterdam and just all of those cities. One of the things I always loved about being in the Netherlands, just as it kind of relates back to Kentucky, is their sort of ability to travel regionally. You could just hop on a bike and go to another city. And that to me is directly parallel to what could be the case in Lexington with Georgetown and all of the other kind of smaller towns around. We could easily be doing those kinds of things. And I think that's a great kind of parallel.
Yeah, I think that's all really good points. And I think that those are, it's nice to have those kind of aspirational places that we look to. Oftentimes we get the comment of, well, this is Kentucky or this is Lexington, so why are we looking at those other places? But, those other places grew and developed because they looked at other places. And, a lot of the places that you all mentioned are very old cities that have changed and grown and developed and gone through growing pains of their own over time. So it's important that we do look to history and to how civilization has grown to see where we should be headed. Great. So now that we've kind of heard what it is on, what you all mentioned, I want to get a little bit into what, kind of myself and my colleague Valerie Friedman sort of say when we describe urban design. So we tend to say that that urban design is really it sits at the middle of architecture, land use planning, and landscape architecture. And it's really about the spaces between that make up a city. But so, that's kind of the definition on paper, but really let's get to the reality of what that looks like in context. You go to the next slide, Valerie. So in this image, both of these images have the same components of a roadway, a sidewalk, some street trees, a building edge, and the things that make them, different are really the good, purposeful urban design. And so I would like to invite any of you to kind of tell me what are the qualities that make a place an example of good urban design and others not. And feel free to mark up the pages as you guys are already doing. Louis, I see you look like you're ready to talk.
We've been talking about this a lot internally. There's a couple of things when it seems so obvious when you look at the two pictures. And I think oftentimes in our cities, as we move around, we get so used to these environments, right? And it's just, you don't think about it. You think about what it is and don't really think about it could be any other way. And I think that the picture on the right is a great example of that. Is like, why is that street that wide? And the impact that has on your experience as far as how fast cars go and all of those things. And we've been talking with our architects a lot, and when developers come in to do projects and thinking about how wide sidewalks are, where the curbs go, and challenging those things, it's like, how are we making those decisions from a policy standpoint at a city level to really create more space like you're seeing getting sketched onto these streets? I think that's something that we're seeing happening all the time now. And on the building side, and I'd love obviously our architects to talk about this, but things like ambient light that come from buildings. So imagine being on that street on the right at night and how sort of like alone you would feel versus on the left, you'd have people in their living rooms finishing dinner or, noise and things kind of spilling out to the street. I think those are all really kind of critical pieces of it.
I really love seeing you guys mark this up real time. This is very exciting for me.
Sam, for me, it's really the human scale. That's the what comes out and jumps out in the image of the left. I mean, the proportion of all the elements in the streetscape, they're really kind of encouraging this human interaction with the streetscape. And The addition of greenery and the fact that the building interacts with the street and doesn't reject it, like on the image on the right, the street almost seems like the building almost seems ambivalent to the fact that there's a street there, right? But you know, all the eyes, I think Liz is drawing someone on the balcony, and that's kind of exactly what I was about to reference here. It's really the eyes on the street. You know, this is a pretty basic concept that we've been talking about ever since Jane Jacobs, and it's really about, you know, feeling seen, feeling safe, having things that activate the street, and having things that feel like you should be there, not that you are kind of intruding in this back of house.
Yeah, I would just agree with everything that's been said. One of the things that we always talk about with our students when we're thinking about designing a building is really extending outward from the facade all the way to the street edge, and thinking about how are we creating layers of space and occupancy for multiple types of people, for multiple types of dwelling, and then also providing these kinds of critical edges and boundaries that human beings crave in order to sort of feel safe and contained. So on the image on the left, that street buffer where we see a line of trees and that little patch of grass that separates pedestrians from street traffic is so critical. Many of us who walk down Nicholasville Road have had that harrowing experience of feeling that, you know, cars are rushing past only 2 feet away with absolutely nothing protecting us from an errant driver. So I think that layering of space from the facade all the way to where vehicles exist is really quite critical.
I would agree with what everyone has said about this sort of safety aspect of having the green buffer between the pedestrians and the street, and also looking at the width of the sidewalk on the greener photo and comparing it to the other one, thinking about things like accessibility. And while there's certainly room for someone in a wheelchair to go down that more narrow sidewalk, there's not room for someone to walk beside them. So sort of thinking about the use of having folks able to be together as they're going down the street, and not to just be in that sort of cavern.
Mm-hmm.
I think one other thing, maybe we're talking a lot about how people feel, but also just the sort of multiple benefits of the design on the left. I mean, the additional tree canopy and what that would do for urban heat island, what that'll do for stormwater, what that'll do for heating and cooling the apartments or the condos that are left of that. The value, right, of those units is because they're on a beautiful street versus on the right side. There's very little economic value for a city from that back of house side. We've kind of actually lessened the value of whatever's across the street by creating that negative kind of condition. And so thinking about how the economics of space and sort of the environmental aspects of all these things come together. And oftentimes we forget that it's not just feel good stuff. It's also these other things that are very real kind of positive benefits for our cities.
Liz mentioned a little bit about the layering, and I just want to go back to that because one of the important things about having residential on the street is all that perception of safety. But also we have to think about the residential tenant, right? And here in this particular example, we see that that ground level is actually elevated above the street level. And that's a very important move because it adds a sense of privacy for the residential tenant, where you have a little bit of a separation between the street and and kind of that ground level. So you don't feel like people are looking into your house at all times. And it also creates kind of this idea of almost a front porch. I've lived with front porches in the last 5 years, and that's kind of how I've met and socialized with most of my neighbors. Having that outdoor, kind of indoor-outdoor space is really crucial to not just creating a great street, but kind of fostering that sense of community.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That front porch culture is really key. Liz, you were going to say something?
I was just going to add to that, for, you know, thinking of the slide on the right, the way architecture and architectural facades meet the street is a way to help people understand how to use places. How it contributes to wayfinding. It contributes to the social and cultural connection that we feel between people who are on the inside of buildings and the outside of buildings. It not only contributes to a sense of safety, but it also contributes to our understanding of all of the people who contribute to our city's life.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that there very much needs to be porosity between buildings, the inside of buildings and the outside, to make a space feel really alive and used.
Sam, real quick, I think that's a great point that Liz just made. And this is like so mundane, but good urban design can sometimes just be boiled down to how you deal with the fronts and backs of buildings. Like, did you do that right? That makes a huge difference.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's not to say that the image on the right is not salvageable, right? I mean, we just sketched a few basic elements to improve the streetscape to make it a little bit more human. And it does become a lot better. But what do you do with the actual building frontage where there is back of house? And it is likely, it's likely very complicated and probably economically impossible to add windows and make it a usable space. So at that point, we have to think about how do you improve what we have, knowing that the building is perhaps in the long term going to stay the same. There are some facade treatments that you can do on a flat facade. I think public art or introducing color is something that can always kind of help create a little bit of vibrancy where there is none. But it's really about that kind of that experience on the street. And I think greenery is the easiest, best way to do that. It really kind of connects us a lot more to our surroundings when we have a lot of green and vibrancy in that way.
Yeah, I think people's reaction is often to just say like, well, we're going to have this blank facade, so let's just put a mural on it. And I feel like oftentimes murals are used as, while they're great for public art, they're also used as Band-Aids when we should be solving the issue through better design in a lot of cases.
And the mural of the 21st century is kind of that LED billboard that is put on top of the parking garages, right? And it is a Band-Aid. So we really have to think critically about, what are we contributing long term when we add a building, and how, like Lois said, the front and the back, are you figuring that out?
Well, fantastic. Okay, let's move on to our next image. And this one I'll kind of direct maybe to Liz and Autumn first, but obviously anyone jump in. So when we're thinking about infill and redevelopment, which is kind of a big topic, especially in Lexington, since we have the urban service boundary that's holding us. And so, we need to figure out how to grow with what we have. Infill projects have to acknowledge their immediate context, but what that means might vary from person to person. So how do you approach context, and what does it mean for a project to be context aware?
I think a lot of the times when people hear context aware, they think the same. They want something that matches exactly what's already there. And mass and scale are certainly important to consider when you're doing that. But in Lexington, something that we're having to look at is scaling up as we grow. So I think that things like lotting patterns and setbacks are really critical to sort of establish a similar rhythm in these neighborhoods that allows for a larger, taller structure to come in and still fit the character of the neighborhood.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I would say that number one, we always start to think about scale, the size, the proportion, these kinds of regulating lines that exist in that kind of pre-exist with older historic existing buildings, and making sure that the new architecture is kind of building off of that patterning of an urban fabric. Setbacks and the space around a building, when you have to scale up, let's say, and create a building that is much larger than an existing neighborhood or an existing context, then I think we can also start to think about, again, creating those layers of occupancy by either stepping the building mass back so that what engages the immediate neighbors is still kind of proportioned. So for instance, in the slide at the right, we might create a block of the mass that is respecting the scale of the neighboring buildings, and then, you know, pushing back in scale, stepping back so that the building mass doesn't tower over existing neighbors, depriving them of light or views, things that are probably important to those people who live in those buildings. And then I would say at every turn, thinking about, again, ways of creating opportunities for inhabitation and dwelling, whether it's looking at front porches like we see on the left that are kind of echoed in this development on the right, or whether it's creating opportunities for wildlife and landscape to occupy a context. Those would be the things that I would always start to kind of look at.
You know, for me, it's so I grew up in a pretty dense city, and I had the fortunate experience where we would actually play on the street in front of my house, even though it was kind of a side street, kind of like the image on the left, not a main road. But there was enough separation from kind of our residential street, which had, you know, commercial too, and the main street where we felt safe on it. And a lot of it had to do with kind of the materiality of everything and kind of the tree and the canopy. And I think in the image on the left and the right, you see two very different approaches to kind of how the street interacts with its surroundings, right? On the right, we have kind of that shared street Wiener type thing, which is a kind of a great way to kind of blend the modes, and you can still do it and be a very safe environment. And on the image on the left, we have kind of a residential street that has a lot of the great components that we look in a street. It could still be better, right? You could add bump outs. You could even, you could start talking about brick or improving the crosswalks. So there's still kind of room for improvement there. But what I would like to kind of finish on here is that you don't really have to leave the region to see good urban design and info examples. There's some really great kind of precedents and really great things to learn just from kind of our peer cities like Indy, and even some cities that are less relatable but still have a lot to teach us, like Detroit.
Yeah, that's great. You guys touched on, you know, kind of this idea of gentle density, or, you know, transitioning height planes that I think is so important to, you know, how do you kind of squeeze in more people, more, you know, more density, et cetera, into a city that's growing, but still, you know, keep the feel and the quality of what we love about that place so much.
Well, and one of the things also that we can do to become more site sensitive, when we were talking earlier about the limitations of, let's say, adding public art, while a building itself might, you know, if an existing building is inhospitable, there still is opportunity at the scale of thinking about, you know, like furniture, like we see here, how can we create spaces for tables or chairs or benches, shade structures, and things that allow people to kind of dwell in a place and feel a part of that context.
Great point.
Yeah, I think that was and obviously this is the landscape architect of it, and both of these pictures, what I start looking at is just the street. I think what Liz was just getting at, the one on the right is, you know, beautiful architecture, but I think the street leaves a lot to be desired. And there's some things, you know, we all talked about these other cities, older cities, European cities and things. I start to look at the curbs there and wonder, you know, other cities don't drain, like just always put curbs in. There's ways to handle stormwater that allows that kind of public realm to be a more smooth transition that is better for, you know, multiple generations, for kids, for seniors, for accessibility. It's better for programming, for allowing those moments to gather, like Liz was saying, to happen. And I think it's the same kind of deal on the left, is thinking about that street. You know, the architecture could be as beautiful as you want, But if the street sucks, you're not going to go there.
Yeah.
It's just as simple as that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Luis, actually, before we move on to to my next question, you had mentioned the term Wooner, and I know that that's a fairly jargony term. Would you mind kind of explaining to everybody what a Wooner is?
It is the the most ultimate, like most jargony term, right? So it's really just a fancy Dutch word for a shared street where pedestrians, cyclists, and car drivers are expected to really kind of share the road, where in the hierarchy of prioritization, really it's the pedestrian who ranks highest, and then the cyclist after that. And then at the very, very bottom of the list is the car driver. And you do that by really making design decisions like putting out street furniture or making it a curbless street. Maybe perhaps some use bollards to create a delineation. Sometimes we use festival curves, which are kind of these curves that kind of slant down at an angle to create the illusion of a curve, but kind of create more of a flat urban environment. So yeah, it's really just a great shared street. See them all the way everywhere in Europe, really. That is more the norm there. But we're starting to see them in the US, and it's kind of a response to places that don't have the density and the vibrancy to do like a Lincoln Road in Miami, or kind of your old school pedestrian mall like in Charlottesville, Virginia, or something like that. But you still want to have kind of the ability to open up the street to vehicles, and you don't want to over design it. So it's a very simple way to allow everyone on the road, but prioritize prioritize pedestrians.
Perfect. Okay, so moving on. So the country right now is kind of smattered with these aging retail centers, office parks, seas of unused parking. So on a larger scale, what are some of the considerations you make as a designer when you're reimagining a site that already has so much context that's there, but also has so much room for opportunity? And Luis, I'll throw this to you first, because this is obviously an image of Fayette Mall. This is what it looks like today, and then this is what you all kind of showed as a reimagination during the Imagine Nicholasville corridor study.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing this example. This was a great project collaboration between MKSK and WSP, looking at bus rapid transit along Nicholasville Road and how that could impact future land uses around transit stations. I think what it's important to note is that so much of our suburban environment have this era of placelessness to them, where they could really be anywhere. You could look at an image and it could be in Pennsylvania, or it can be in Louisville, or it could be in Lexington, and you really wouldn't know. There's kind of a lack of contextual feeling to it. So you have all these spaces that we've designed over the years to really park at capacity, a handful of days a year. And what does that do to the rest of the places around them? It creates these giant parking craters that are unused most of the time, and really are to the detriment of public spaces. They're to the detriment of health by creating heat island areas. And it also is to the detriment of the city, because it creates spaces that are not really fostering a kind of a vibrant mixed-use environment. So when we looked at Fayette Mall, we really looked at the mall entrances and the places that are already activated along the mall and the street, and trying to think, where can we create some vibrant open spaces and plazas to connect to the existing mall, and really focus infill and redevelopment around it. As you can see on the screen, this is a lot of kind of residential and some limited commercial redevelopment in the mall. But from our initial analysis, looking at just the zoning code, the mall property itself was overparked according to the city's own zoning, which had been rezoned to a different commercial zoning that had decreased the kind of the onerous regulation of parking numbers, which I've applauded Lexington for doing many times, and I'm very encouraged by the reducing of parking minimums across the board. I think what reducing parking minimums allows for is to really incentivize developers to really look at these parking craters differently and understanding them as future development paths. And when we think of future development, we really have to think about where we concentrate energy. It's really about creating a space where you can have a district, and really, if you have a thing like the mall, which is such a huge object, assuming that you can't cut the mall or kind of create spaces, pedestrian spaces that connect on the outside of the mall, then you really have to focus on how do you engage the street in a more sensible and human in a way that really creates more of a context to it.
Fantastic.
I think a couple of notes here. One, if we think about how society is dramatically shifting right now, and like when was the last time I went to a Macy's? I have no idea. And so thinking about how developers who own this significant amount of property can be repositioning kind of their land to create, I think what Luis was really getting at there with the energy is create an experience that's going to draw people to a place for a different reason, to spend more time, ultimately spend more money, but also have better kind of opportunities for diverse housing types that are closer to these things. If we put people near shopping, near these other resources, we can be pulling travel, trips off the road and helping with overall traffic issues on Nicholas Hill Road, which is a huge problem, as everybody who's ever been to Lexington knows. So there's a lot of value, and I think it's really important to talk about parking, because to me, everybody on every project I've ever worked on gets incredibly defensive about their parking. And I think if we take an objective look at how completely inefficient parking is, especially surface parking, we don't or wouldn't think that that was a good investment in like any other scenario except for that one. And so I think there's a lot of discussion to be had about how it's really about efficiency and ultimately a value. And that's not just economic value, but like societal value and all the things like Luis was just talking about. And that's a really big conversation, especially for a city like Lexington with an urban services boundary. Is every kind of ounce of energy and investment we can put into our property to make it work better for people is important. It's just, this is super cheesy, but it's like your cell phone, right? It does 100 different things. And so we can't really afford for surface parking to just be surface parking because it's only being used in such a limited capacity. It needs to be doing more for our cities and for our people.
And I'll just add too, in terms of thinking about that societal value, if we think of comparing, let's say, Fayette Mall to even just the Summit, which is just further down the street. The differences there in terms of experiences or possible experiences are so drastic. I'm thinking about my children who are old enough to have some independence, but yet not driving, not on their own. When I'm now able to kind of drop my daughter and her friends off at the Summit because I feel pretty comfortable that they can walk around that scale of environment. And there are little green spaces where they can play cornhole, or they can sit with their friends and not even necessarily spend money, but just be there and feel independent, where I would probably not have the same level of safety dropping them off in the parking lot of Fayette Mall. So these are things, again, that I think go to serving that kind of multi-generational experience of public space that we all desire. And there's so much territory that is owned privately by these large retailers that inspiring them in ways to create public space where people can go and just simply sit for a while is a huge boon to our community.
I think kind of to tack on to what Liz was saying about dropping her kids off at the Summit and things like that. I think that with these other older style malls, that used to be where teens would go to hang out, but with a lot of the retail stores leaving and sort of the less eyes on the street things, we're seeing a lot more of these like curfews for teens and things like that, where they can't go and hang out in the mall. And some of these malls, not necessarily Fayette Mall, But others had sort of these large interior plazas with windows or fountains or that sort of thing. So it's kind of interesting to think about what the adaptive reuse might be of those, maybe in smaller towns where we're less likely to see sort of a full-scale redevelopment like we might see at Fayette Mall. But whether or not those existing buildings, these big, huge boxes that do sort of have a pedestrian network inside and plazas could be reused for something else. And I think that's something we see in small towns sometimes, where you might see a local church go into an old retail structure or something like that. And it just makes me curious as to whether or not those could be reused for other things like residential purposes.
That's a great comment, Autumn, because we've been working with malls across the country, kind of figuring out what to do with these giant properties. Because like Lois was saying, retail is changing. We suburbanized our downtowns because retail was changing in the 50s and 60s. And now, retail is changing again, and we're urbanizing our suburban kind of typologies. And, the community centers, libraries, health facilities, residential, these are all things that have been done and have worked successfully in other places because, there's a lifespan to these types of structures. And many across the country are kind of approaching a tipping point where that lifespan is approaching.
I think that's a really good point. A couple of things. So the built-in obsolescence, which everybody I think is probably familiar. If you're not familiar with that jargon phrase, but just your iPhone, right? And everybody, it's built in to that you need to upgrade it all the time. And the same happens with commercial retail buildings, where a developer will build a building at a certain price point, knowing that after 20 years, they've made the money that they need to, and that building can just disintegrate for all they care. And so that's an issue. And it's interesting that like we as cities allow that to be the value judgment that they can make, because if we could make that not a reasonable economic position for them, they would do it differently. They do it differently all the time. Also in the chat, I dropped a book in by Donald Shoup. It's called The High Cost of Free Parking. I think that's another incredible way for us to all educate ourselves, is that there is no such thing as free parking, even on these private properties. Think about the amount of stormwater that runs off of these things. And a lot of people may not realize this, but typically the biggest energy user for any city is our ability and how we clean stormwater and wastewater. And so every time we're just allowing dirty water to go into our sewers, we as citizens are paying on the back end to clean that water. And, we're driving up energy use and doing all those things that are impacting climate change and all of those things. So I think thinking really critically about how we as a city invest in parking or not is really critical. And that's a really good book. Donald Shoup, we've heard him talk. He's incredible. So I would highly suggest looking into that.
And I can't stress enough how important it is to talk about parking. I mean, that is it's such a big impediment to a lot of great urban design. And being a Midwestern city, when we talk about urban, district making or infill development, we are often challenged to talk about parking. And I think we have to consider it. People are still going to drive. I mean, we're not suddenly going to become New York City, but we have an opportunity to encourage places where it's not your only option. You have the option to walk, you have the option to bike, and you can make that mode choice. And I live in a neighborhood in Louisville where I have that, I can make that mode choice, but most of people here don't. And when you make it the only mode of transport, because encouraging things like parking, then it stays the only mode of transport.
Wow, that was a good unpacking of that.
Hey, Sam, I want to make one point on that, because I think it's really important. Is it's easy for us as people of privilege to talk about cars and like access, but there's a lot of people who can't afford a car. And so if we only allow places to be accessible by vehicles, then we're leaving an incredible amount of our society behind and making their lives more difficult. So I think that's to Luis's point, and why a BRT and fixing transit and providing alternative ways for people to move around a city that are dignified, safe, and great is so totally important.
Okay. Oh, Liz, did you want to say something?
No, I was just saying yes to the idea of providing equitable modes of living in a city.
Well, and so that kind of leads me into our next image. And I think it's really interesting that you all kind of brought up, Liz and Autumn and stuff brought up this idea of needing places to gather. And I think that there are also some distinct tones of inequality and inequity in how we talk about gathering spaces, because for a lot of us that present the way that we on the panel are currently, we're gathering, we're meeting with friends. For other folks, it's loitering. And so, it's how do you deal with places where you're trying to encourage people, you're trying to encourage what we in kind of the design profession call a stickiness. Like how do you get people to stay in a place and linger, and be accepting of that, but then not be shooing away people of a different race, a different socioeconomic status, a different age, teenagers. Wouldn't you rather see teenagers lingering in a public plaza than you would seeing them off, making mischief somewhere else? So, I guess that's sort of a separate thought, or maybe a same thought, as to, what makes a public space, what are key factors in like why a space is usable and welcoming versus not?
I think a big thing is giving people a reason to be there. Like in the right-hand image, we see that there is a lot of street furniture and ability to sit down and chat. So there's, something to do and something to keep you there. And I think we see a lot of the public art, like we talked about before, that murals are great to an extent, but they don't necessarily keep you there. I think that adding in elements of play can be really invigorating to a space. And just an example of that in Lexington would be the fountains at the courthouse in the summer. I always think it's really cool to see like all of the different kinds of people that are congregating in that area on a hot summer day, because you've got families with kids that are playing, and you've got folks who are visiting the courthouse for various reasons. And then you've got people who work in downtown who might be just sitting there having their lunch, and sort of having that ability to sort of add that playfulness, I think is really cool.
Yeah, and I would add, in addition to providing more space and zones of space that are scaled to the human body, and perhaps provide a variety of sort of smaller outdoor rooms that allow multiple large numbers of people to be in the same space, but yet feel like they've claimed their own little part of that space is a really valuable way of thinking about things. So for instance, on the image on the right, you can see there's lots of little zones. There's the zone of the bench, there's the zone of the chairs, then there's the zone of the grassy plaza. These are all ways of subdividing space that allow multiple parties to kind of occupy a place at once. And to Autumn's point, thinking about the importance of play, I always link that also to thinking about urban spaces over time. So whether that's how they transform or able to be occupied in a variety of ways from morning till night, or whether that's thinking about them seasonally. So for instance, sometimes we look at urban design proposals and they're always kind of shown on the most beautiful day in spring. But what do those places look like and feel like in winter? So on the slide on the left, we can see maybe it's okay to be there. I see that one tiny little person kind of right here, but we don't see anything that is scaled to the proportion of the human body. There's also very little containment or protection from wind, from the sun. What does a space look like in a blazing hot, what does it feel like on a blazing hot autumn or August day? And what does it feel like in the dead of winter? So thinking about climate, thinking about some of those also more ephemeral aspects of being in a place. So what is the light like? Artificial light. How does it feel at night? Are there places where you can kind of sit and take refuge and just rest for a while? When I'm encouraging my students to think about designing public space, I always ask them to think about 3 different narratives of 3 very diverse people that they might imagine designing for. So for instance, someone who, I always use the example because it's been my experience, someone who has a stroller or is accompanying a person who is in a wheelchair. How are they able to move around? And how does the space accommodate what circumstances in life that just might pop up? How do we, like you say, Sam, how are we accommodating the most needy residents of our community who may not have safe housing, who may not have places to go in the day where they feel welcome? How can our public spaces be those places and provide that sense of security, that sense of welcome that all people deserve? I really appreciate when Lewis was mentioning this word dignity. We are obligated as designers and as members of our communities to really think about the humanity of everyone who lives in our cities.
Yes. I'm sorry, I was just going to build on that. I mean, I think to all those points that you've mentioned, it's a really great thing to think about, because it was again, it's another thing we get asked by clients, cities, developers is, well, I don't want to put a bench here because somebody's going to sleep on it.
Mhm.
And to that, we push back and say, okay, well, who has the right to comfort? And is it only certain types of people that you don't want sleeping on that bench? Or, because when we design spaces to be uncomfortable for one segment of our, population, it's just making things uncomfortable for literally everyone. And so I think thinking about that perspective is incredibly important. And who has the right to comfort? And that's everybody, and so I think Liz, I love that example of just having your students think about the experiences from everybody's perspective, thinking about the people who work there, the people who are there trying to be safe or trying to warm up, or Autumn is your example, trying to cool down. I mean, think about that in the summer. If you don't have access to air conditioning and that's your one chance to get cooled off, how important is that little bit of water or shade that other people might totally take for granted? And so those are all incredible points, I think, very important.
Yeah, and I kind of just want to build on that, and this may be off topic as I start all great conversations. So it's really, for me, these 2 spaces, I think we could have a whole session just talking about Boston City Hall Plaza, right? I mean, but they're almost a reflection of the perception that we have of the institutions that anchor them. Boston City Hall Plaza, City Hall, it's an oppressive environment where the building has this monumental scale. I mean, it's a brutalist building, it's a design competition. Many architects love it. It was all my architecture professors loved it. And, but as a visitor to the plaza, you feel much smaller to everything else around your surroundings. It is meant for you almost to feel a little insignificant and kind of in awe of the power of City Hall. That is the role of public space in this environment. Whereas Bryant Park, its institution that anchors at the New York Public Library, that is the people's place. That is a community place. That is a place for gathering. And Bryant Park is a reflection of that. It invites people in. It hosts community events. It is, as everyone's been saying, the layers, the rooms, the places, it's all very inviting. And I think the changing face of municipal government over the last few years, trying to create a friendlier interface in everything we do between interactions between cities and citizens, that's changing. And we see a reflection of that in the updated designs for Boston City Hall Plaza, which is going to get renovated. I put a link in the chat to that. And that public space is going to be updated to really reflect kind of our more contemporary understanding of the interface between the citizen and those elected leaders. And I would just note that, City Hall itself, it's also a very dysfunctional building that people and municipal employees don't really enjoy, almost a reflection of the plaza itself.
Yeah, that's an interesting note, and maybe a topic of how civic buildings or city halls in particular that Autumn and I work in, how they actually work and are inviting or not to the people that we serve. And having grown up in Boston, yes, like City Hall Plaza, you really only choose to go there when one of our sports teams wins. Other than that, it is not at all the scale or the feel of the rest of the city that I know and love. Okay, moving on. So this next one is kind of a question to Louis first, but obviously opened up to anyone. And I think that when we use the term public space, our mind often goes to a plaza or park, like we saw in the previous example. You don't often think of the street as being really an integral part of the public realm. But can you talk a little bit about why and how a well-designed streetscape can go just from asphalt and concrete to a linear park? And also how, we were talking a lot about street trees and how important they are to hold an edge. But in some cases, we aren't allowed to have those street trees right up against the edge. So what do you do to kind of still build that space and make it feel welcoming and have people want to use it?
This is probably my favorite topic. And I think it's just because streets, to me, if you look, and this is one of the things we learned in urban design school, and I'm sure everybody, that goes through those programs learns, is when we as cities, when we build anything, the one thing that lasts almost in perpetuity is streets. You can go to any of those historic cities and think about Rome or Barcelona, and there's still the streets that were originally set up. And it's incredibly difficult to change or remove or, and do anything to a street once it's there. And I think in our perspective, one of the things we really like to talk about is that streets to us are our most important public spaces, because you touch a street essentially every single day, every single person in some way. It's the thing where everything comes together, where you're going to get your groceries or what have you. Everything happens and comes together and meets at the street. And I think what's kind of cool is it's really not rocket science, like for how we create better streets that are more comfortable and serve as great public space. And it comes down to something that I am sure Autumn and Liz are great at, is thinking about the human dimension and like what amount of space do you need, one, to be functional, but also to be really comfortable. And so, you'll see in that top left picture, and this is kind of the norm for a lot of Lexington and other cities, is you get sort of that bare minimum sidewalk. It's maybe 4, maybe 5 feet if you're lucky. It's right up against the curb next to cars that are going 45 miles an hour. Well, if I'm walking down that sidewalk with my double stroller with my 3-year-old and my 5-year-old, nobody can get around me. So the person coming towards me is stepping either into the street or onto, into the grass. And if that person's in a wheelchair, like they really can't even do it. So thinking about the functional dimensions of streets, how much space do you need to just walk comfortably and have couples who can walk side by side, or, if you're deaf and you're using sign language, you need enough space to be next to the person signing so you can see, right? And you might need tactile warnings to warn you that you're coming to an intersection or whatever that thing is, right? So there's all these little dimensions that, again, isn't rocket science. But more often than not, we're not delivering those things as cities, and we're trying to get better at it. I think Town Branch Commons is an incredible example, and obviously that's like a legacy project. But thinking about the bike facilities, getting those bikes off of, that was a contentious conversation, was exchanging bike lanes for a multi-use path. And to us, I think the big discussion there was, if we could put people on bikes behind a curb and protect them from cars, one, that's a better situation for almost everybody. And two is thinking about like, okay, if I'm going to go and just release my 5-year-old on her bike with training wheels Am I ever going to do that in a bike lane on Vine Street? No, like, no, that'd be insane. But on Town Ranch Commons, I can, like, I can do that. And, you know, that's just one perspective. There's a lot of different ways to think about that. So the way that that happens is what y'all are kind of sketching on here, is this detail, and that my little pink line is too small, but about how much space we're providing, physical barriers that we're providing to the road to allow people to feel comfortable, literally to protect people. It doesn't always have to be trees. And actually in this instance, I don't think we have the space to get trees here. It's just going to be beautiful native flowers and grasses and things there. And you'll see that downtown on Vine Street, where we literally only had 2 feet. So we got grasses in. Just that little bit of sort of vertical element to provide a little bit of visual buffer was really important. I lost track of where I was going with my rant, but I was just going. But there's a lot of great examples. We were just giving this conversation to our architects because oftentimes who determines what the street looks like aren't landscape architects, actually. It's usually like a civil engineer or an architect who haven't spent years kind of thinking about this. So what I was thinking about was there's kind of 3 or 4 distinct elements to a street. And this is just basic. Behind the curb, you need anywhere from 3 to 6 feet minimum as a zone next to the curb where you could put street trees. You just have a buffer where people can get out of a parked car on a parallel parking spot. You just need that little bit of space. You can go bigger. For a sidewalk, you need 8 feet, especially in an urban environment. You need at least 8 feet. It can definitely be bigger. But to get couples who can walk past each other, you know, people groups, strollers, wheelchairs, et cetera, you need 8 feet. And then there's actually another zone outside of that by the building where you need 3 or 5 more feet if you want cafe tables. And we'll talk about Norton Commons here in a minute. But you can think about the streets where you're kind of dodging back and forth, trying to avoid the street furniture and things. That's because they didn't have enough space. And so you need another zone for that. And so what we're talking about there is like 20 feet, 20 to 25 feet for a nice urban street kind of sidewalk condition. And how often do we have that? Pretty rarely, but we dedicated an incredible amount of space to drive lanes for cars to go through and to parking again. So that's a big conversation, is how do we weigh the value of that public space, sidewalk space versus on-street parking space, right? I think that's a great conversation to have, which we've probably beaten too far into the ground at this point.
Awesome. Well, let me keep you guys moving so that we kind of stay on task and on time. Let's see what we have up next, Valerie. Great. So this is kind of a question for maybe the architects a little bit more, but it's about, you know, adaptive reuse and when we're thinking about what do you keep when you make the decision to reuse a building or a landscape? What's important to keep? What can you leave aside? These are both examples from Atlanta that I think a lot of people are familiar with. The Beltline was is 22 miles of what was formerly a rail line that went around the city and is now a multi-use trail, and they've got development that's now all facing it. And then the Ponce City Market is, a former Sears catalog warehouse and a Ford factory, I think, before that. But these are, both pretty good examples of adaptive reuse. So maybe Liz or Autumn.
I would say that the first place that architects would always start in making those decisions would be by listening to the community who lives there. So often we can come to places, and if we're not listening to the stewards of the community who are connected and really a part of that place, we can look at buildings and just be looking at them as kind of static objects, rather than living, kind of growing, adapting places that hold and contain, again, that idea of a collective identity and the memory of what has happened there previously. So I would say, number one, we always want to start by preserving those elements of place that community members deem significant to their sense of connection. And then a second priority in determining what to keep and what to kind of transform would be increasingly thinking about things environmentally, thinking about what can we salvage, what can we reuse to cut down on the new materials and new things that we have to continually produce. What can we preserve and conserve in the ways that we design things? And this might be looking at anything from the structure of a building to its scale, its way, its surrounding landscapes. But those would be, I think, two top priorities, because, you know, the construction industry consumes a lot of energy. So I think increasingly, as we understand the threats of climate change and how we all contribute to the solution, I would say that you know, the question of materials would be something that would be on the forefront of my mind. Following that, again, thinking about it in terms of its social or cultural import.
Autumn?
I think another important thing to consider with these, and sort of in two different ways with these two examples, is connectivity. With a lot of these sort of adaptive reuse of old industrial buildings that are really great buildings, they're not always in the most convenient location to really bring in these new uses that we desire to have there. So we really have to look at the infrastructure and whether or not there are safe ways for pedestrians to get there and safe places for people to park and things like that. And then with sort of these linear parks that come in and are adaptively reusing old rails or highways or that sort of thing, sort of bringing back the connectivity into the neighborhoods that those maybe originally just plowed right through, and sort of trying to get those interconnected again in a new and meaningful way that allows folks to come in and use this new space from varying points of connectivity.
Autumn, that's a great point. And I think it also loops back to what Louis and Luis were both saying in the beginning, that effective urban design is often dealing with the front and the back side of buildings. And so in a place like the Beltline, or if you think of the High Line in New York, part of the wonderful opportunity that these projects have offered cities is that what once was the kind of unusable backside of buildings has now been redesigned and rethought about so that those become really dynamic front sides. And that willingness to consider and reconsider the formal and spatial organization of cities is really valuable when thinking about adaptive reuse projects.
Just kind of note, these are all great points. And I really want to note that interaction between the buildings, the public spaces, and the trail itself, you know, that's not incidental. These are decisions that were made by the private market and by the public and by the city itself. Atlanta instituted a Beltline overlay to really ensure that new development fronts the trail itself, and the public spaces are really kind of geared around this great new asset. And I used to live in Atlanta, and I remember, you know, Pond City Market, we called it City Hall East. The Kroger next door, it was called the Murder Kroger. These are places that back then, it was almost unimaginable to think of this, you know, this amazing amenity and, you know, all the retail and kind of, you know, all the office space that has really come up. And I only say this because many times when we present this example, people say, well, we're not Atlanta. Well, it was unimaginable in Atlanta as well. You know, these are places that really had the willingness and kind of the sheer fortitude to go for it and really start somewhere. I would like to note that some of these investments tend to be in white neighborhoods and places that are already relatively doing okay. we need to really make sure, like the Beltline is doing, the Beltline does a loop around the city, touching some of the city's most disadvantaged neighborhoods as well. But the first investments were in primarily white areas. We really need to focus on, if we have a great amenity and a great connectivity, how can we actually make sure that it impacts people that have been disenfranchised in the back? There's an equity component to connectivity that I think we always need to remember.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's the other thing too, and since we have so many great people from our planning staff on the call, is thinking about the policy that needs to be paired with these kinds of civic investments to allow, affordable housing to exist on the Beltline. And that's a huge point of contention with the Beltline itself. It's now nobody can afford to live there, and that's, it's totally crazy. It's beyond their wildest dreams, I think to kind of Liz and Autumn's points about historic adaptive reuse. There's some really incredible examples in Lexington. I mean, there are amazing, incredible architects in our city and from around the country really that are working there. I mean, at the University of Kentucky, what's happening right now with the Reynolds building and the design school. I mean, think about that. Think about the Gray Line station in the market, a former Greyhound bus station and like workshop that's now a market space and retail venue. There's places like County Club on North Limestone. I'm just giving you all the places I like to eat, but it's a cinder block building that was like nothing, right? It was just a plain cinder block building. I doubt that an architect even designed it. It was probably just a contractor put up a CMU building. And now it's like this incredibly charming, rustic, amazing place to get a bite to eat. So thinking about how we can reuse those spaces, they don't all have to be, I think when we think about adaptive reuse and historic preservation, we think about these really chic things that are already really cool. And it doesn't have to be that. I think it could be, there's so many great examples in Lexington of kind of other versions. It's really neat.
Well, so we are rapidly approaching kind of our end time. So we didn't get to all of the visuals that I wanted to show, but Valerie, if you want to stop sharing your screen so we can see everybody again. I personally want to get to like one kind of question that's super important to me, and I think a lot of us here in planning, but it's talking about the elephant in the room, and that's equity. And often we hear that good design can only be afforded by those with means. And is that true? And what can we do to combat that, or to combat that stereotype, I guess?
Not true.
I agree that good design should be good design because it is accessible and it is available to the people who need it most. I guess in response, what I'll say is kind of maybe piggybacking a bit on to what Luis just said, though, and thinking about how over the course of the 20th century, our infrastructure and the building of our roads, the building of our highways was traditionally done at the expense of traditionally Black communities and minority communities. They are the residents of our national community that have bore the brunt of a lot of very poor urban design decisions that have divided and decimated really vibrant communities. What we have as urban designers and as architects now is an opportunity to address that inequity and offer the beginnings of what I believe are necessary reparations for the impact that we have imposed upon people who have been traditionally left out of systemic power structures. So I think that equity, diversity, inclusion, these are the most pressing and most important values that we can embed within every design decision, because that is the only way that we will all come to living in a country that is sustainable and kind of fair for all.
That's such a great point. And I really want to go back to really the term dignity. And it's really the fact that so many of our investments are in these well-to-do, primarily white neighborhoods. And there's something that we owe to the communities that we've left behind. And the great streets, great infrastructure, these should be considered basic necessities that should be applied to all areas. I think a lot of us in the design profession are fortunate enough to live in a bubble of privilege. And people outside of this bubble, they are used to broken sidewalks. They're used to lack of curbs. They're used to not having crosswalks or unsafe crossing. That should not be the case, right? We really need to make sure that residential streets across our cities, and especially in those neighborhoods where people are more likely to walk or ride their bike because there's a mode choice, there's an economic mode choice there. We need to make sure that those are the places where we're prioritizing these investments, and not just places where there's a kind of political advantages that allow for them to receive the brunt of the investments.
I think like one of the things, we hear the word systemic a lot, right? Systemic racism, those sorts of things. I like to think about it as a designer. Our goal should be to provide systemic benefits, right? Like we can do that. And I think to all of y'all's points, which I totally agree with, we have to look at the really big picture about what Luis is talking about providing those great streets in all neighborhoods, especially where it relies on people or where people rely on them the most. And seeing that if we can make those investments, the amount of potential that is there, what people could do is like, it's unbelievable. It's almost unmeasurable what they could do. And so the more we can think strategically, and I think that's kind of the whole point of urban design in theory, is where all these things come together. So seeing where cities are building libraries with housing attached, or doing affordable housing specifically, but really getting together, because I think you're right, like design, like we cost money and we're expensive. That's for real. But we also donate an incredible amount of time, but we shouldn't have to in our cities. When we can talk about design, we can talk about these projects. What we need to be talking about for this specific conversation is our municipal budgets. And that is a value statement that we're making about how we want to live and how we think people should be living, is where we're putting those dollars as cities. And we can change that, right? Like as a community, we can decide, what do we value the most? Do we value education? Do we value parks, et cetera, et cetera? We have incredible amounts of money in our cities today. It's just how we're kind of aiming those investments that probably needs to be reevaluated to do exactly what you're talking about, to give people access and provide projects that can do that sort of systemic benefit sort of thing.
I think from a planning perspective too, I think that we can sort of guide some of this change through regulatory changes and things in the way that we govern. But I think there's also a call for us to have some sort of flexibility and offer some relief valves for when designers come to us with creative ideas that are not within our existing sort of framework, and to really, look at things from that dignity perspective and see if there is a way to help folks get there when they're bringing us something that can provide that sort of systemic benefits. And I think that we can encourage that, by bringing in some additional like small scale mixed use type things. And I'll throw in a plug for ADUs because that recently got passed, and I know Chris Taylor's listening.
Awesome. So we are like very close to the end, and really quick in 1 minute, and to end on like a happy note, I'd like each of you to say your favorite place in Lexington, excuse me, that you think is working well. Liz?
I am so invigorated by Town Branch Trail and the potential of biking from downtown all the way out to Manchester and the horse park. And I just find that to be something that is so exciting. And I hope it runs down the middle of Nicholasville Road within the next 10 years.
Louis?
It feels like a total cop out, but I mean, to me, Town Branch Commons is the thing, but it's the thing, not just because it's Town Branch Commons that we were involved in it, but I think what we're going to see, and I said this to Jim Gray years ago, people don't realize we're literally transforming the entire city through that project. And not just with that specific, 30 feet of streetscape that we're doing, but with all the things that are going to happen along it. Thinking about Town Branch Park, Phoenix Park, Charles Young Park, all of these things that are going to, run out, the regional connectivity that's really going to be connected so people can live in the suburbs and just bike downtown if they want to. Like, that's huge. There's very few communities in our state and in our region that are able to do that. That's incredible. That's something to me that's like totally exciting.
I have a really mundane one, but it is part of Town Branch Commons, is that new crosswalk from the Transit Center garage to the Phoenix building. I was just thinking this morning about how much more convenient that was than trying to Frogger across the street or walk all the way up to the intersection of Limestone and Vine like we used to have to do. So that's been inspiring to me.
So I guess I'll try not to do a Town Branch Commons, even though I still think that's a great example. So I personally love the atmosphere and the environment of Cheapside Park downtown. I think that's a great space that's welcoming to everyone in the region and really kind of creates a front door for downtown. I also really love the retail strip in the Chevy Chase neighborhood. I think that's a great example of retail that's surrounded by residential, and it works. I think the street could use a little bit of right sizing there. And we could really narrow things down a little, but I think there's a lot to work with there and a lot of great character that's very Lexington. And I think that's the biggest compliment you can do.
Fantastic. And I'll throw mine in. I'm a big fan of Distillery District and everything that they're working on and have done out there. But it's also a good example, like Autumn was saying, of places that have maybe grown quickly and still are trying to figure out, how to get people there and out. Okay, well, thank you all so much. For those of you watching, if you want to follow up with any of us, feel free to reach out. If you're seeking AICP credits, this session is eligible. You can watch this webinar again or share it with a friend or colleague via our website, imaginelexington.com, or see it on Lex TV on Saturday. So again, I want to thank Louis Johnson, Liz Swanson, Louise Huber-Calvo, and Autumn Goderwis. Our coordinator today was Valerie Friedman. Our live Q&A support, even though I don't think we got any questions, was Chris Taylor. Our technical support was Libby Jefferson, and we want to thank Lex TV as always. So this webinar closes out 2021 for us, but we will be back in 2022 with a bang. On February 1st and 2nd, Mornings with Planning will return with a very special 2-day ADU conference. That's accessory dwelling units. This event, in partnership with Louisville Metro Planning and AARP, will be 6 sessions over 2 mornings with a focus on training for builders, appraisers, real estate agents, and lenders for all things related to accessory dwelling units. You can register at www.imaginelexington.com/ADU-conference. We look forward to seeing everyone there. The Mornings with Planning webinar series will continue to discuss new ways to reconnect, reimagine, and respond in a new reality. We want to hear from you. What topics should we discuss as we move Lexington forward together? Email us at imagine@lexingtonky.gov to let us know. We'll be skipping the first Wednesday of the new year to bring you our special ADU programming in February, with a return to our regular first Wednesday morning of the month programming in March. For more information on future sessions, to access the recording from this webinar, and to learn more about planning in Lexington, visit imaginelexington.com or lexingtonky.gov/planning, and follow us on social media. Thank you for spending your mornings with us, and see you next time.